Thanks. I want to thank Leslie for asking me to be here, and her team is always awesome. Leslie may rue the day, though, when she asked me to moderate something, because moderation to me means N+1, so we'll see how that plays out. I've got a couple of things that I wanted to set this up with, but first maybe we can do a lightning round, a 30-second self-introduction up and down before we go there. So we start with Hunter.
Hunter Hoffman, virtual reality.
Sumit Bhatia, I'm the CEO of Ava Health, and I'm really excited to be here. Dr. Saxon reached out to the Cedars-Sinai TechStars Accelerator to see if there were any companies working in virtual assistants and voice assistants and in healthcare. And our area, we are trying to bring devices like Amazon Alexa to clinical settings like hospitals, places we'll find our loved ones, hospitals and nursing homes and things of that nature, and trying to create better outcomes ultimately, both for the patients but also for the providers from a satisfaction and experience perspective.
Melissa Payne, our innovation strategist. I'm focused mostly on mixed reality right now and thinking very much about our relationship to digital as digital moves off the screen and becomes dimensional.
So Hunter Thompson said when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro, and I'm glad to say that I gave up my amateur status quite some time ago. I wear a couple of different hats. I'm out at the Institute for Creative Technologies. Randy Hill was on a previous panel. He's our executive director. Then I'm faculty at the School of Cinematic Arts. I'm also consulting for RAND on a redo of their public policy curriculum because they recognize that technology and the nature of reality is profoundly changing. And I think I don't need to sell this to anybody in the audience. We've heard a lot about data, and it's funny because 5 or 6 years ago there was a lot of talk about data and not a lot of talk about what that data could do and how it could reach someone. And now this idea of data telling a story and presenting it in some sort of narrative is really part of it. That asterisk is because we increasingly partner with machines, and that man-unmanned machine teaming, which is what the Army refers to it as, or human agent teaming, is a relationship that we haven't really fleshed out. We don't quite know how to build trust with an algorithm and trust with a robot. I think this is an open question. So we know that immersion can have some very good clinical outcomes. You're going to hear about some of Hunter's work, which is quite amazing. And then Skip Rizzo in our labs has done stuff with using VR to treat post-traumatic stress. But more broadly, I'm not quite sure how to do a narrative in there because it sort of breaks the whole format. It's a whole other talk. And again, the same deal. We're dealing increasingly with a combination of humans, machines, and algorithms, and we don't know what those relationships look like. To quote one of my intellectual heroes, Richard Feynman, he talks about the idea that for a successful technology, reality must take precedent over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. It turns out, though, that voice agents can be fooled. And for those that watched the season opener of South Park last week, part of the subplot was Alexa and Google, and the characters were constantly saying Alexa and then something, a bunch of profane stuff that they were asking. And evidently it was setting off thousands of people's home units. So if we buy into this idea of sensors and wearables and digital being able to provide care that scales and gives us capabilities that we could only previously imagine, how are we going to get there? So here are a couple of examples of different modalities. This is a design fiction piece by Keiichi Matsuda. This is a person in Medellin, Colombia, ostensibly wearing an augmented reality display, and you can see the gamification, the rating. We can do a lot of these capabilities right now. We can do, for instance, location-based information and display that. We can present sort of aesthetic changes to our physical mixed reality environment, and then when threats occur, we can then warn people about those. So there's a lot to love in here, and of course you have a cat, because the internet was made for cats. But also there are some things that probably give you pause about persistent advertising platforms, moral and ethical implications of working in that. So we've scratched off now AR and voice agents. What about VR, our last bastion of hope? And it turns out that VR has some problems as well. So, and this, I could watch this all day long since we developed for VR. And one of my colleagues, Evan Rosenberg-Suma, has worked on redirected walking, and he's open sourced the toolkit so that you can take small physical spaces and make them actually feel like the big virtual spaces that you're in. So there's research that's trying to fix this. So I'll put this up to the panel about, okay, I've pointed out the sort of dystopian and humorous applications of the current technology, but I guess maybe we'll start with Sumit, since you actually have something that's working in this space. If you could talk about that and sort of how you got to that point and where you think you can go.
Sure. So there's an opportunity right now to use these devices already. We use them, we interact with them for some basic entertainment, education. Those things actually have value when we talked about isolation earlier, social isolation. There's a lot of value coming out of the ability to interact with devices and get information and perhaps use it to connect with folks. And that's kind of where we're going with our products and services, where we're allowing the patient ostensibly to use the device to connect to their care providers and make requests and allow them to eventually get the type of service where if I ask for something in particular, I can route a request for if I'm hungry, that request can go straight to that individual. And over time, we want these devices to learn. We want them to understand our needs so that, like the best hotels you may go to, they can anticipate. Had this experience a long time ago. You walked into a Four Seasons and they seemed to know what I wanted before I ever asked for it. So we need to make these institutions. We have that opportunity to make these institutions into better places by learning and informing the care providers.
And your applications are working, it's a voice-only system, right? So it's Alexa, so it's the disembodied voice as your interaction to the information.
Yeah, that's correct. It's today, we do see absolutely a future where it's been so great to hear all of the amazing ideas and work that's going on a variety of different platforms, VR, AR, voice. But today we're focused on voice, and just as VSP is trying to make these items, embedded. So as the Marines spoke of earlier, you want devices that kind of disappear, and you don't want to have to think about them. We want those same types of things. Eventually, we want these sensors and these microphones and things built into the buildings directly.
So, Hunter, if we switch to VR, can you talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing up in Washington? Because I think it's really amazing stuff, and it's probably not as widely known as it should be.
Do you want to play the video? So you see the guy, this is a soldier with combat-related burn injuries, getting painful wound care. So the burn patients, when they're recovering from the burns in their hospital, they typically have to have the bandage removed and the wound needs to be cleaned. And during these wound care sessions, the pain is severe to excruciating most patients, despite use of powerful narcotic pain medications. So Dr. Patterson and I, Dave Patterson and I at Harborview Burn Center have been collaborating, developing virtual reality as a non-pharmacologic analgesic, and we're getting 35 to 50% reductions in pain during painful wound care and physical therapy, skin stretching exercises with burn patients. And we've done fMRI brain scans showing reductions in pain-related brain activity during virtual reality. And we even did a comparison between virtual reality and a moderate dose of hydromorphone and showed VR alone worked as well as a moderate dose of hydromorphone. And the two combined were the best.
So how did how did you guys hit upon that? I'm always curious about innovation, right? So how the crazy ideas come up, because I wouldn't, that might not be something that pops into your head that, oh, we can treat this by just sticking somebody in a VR environment.
So at the time, I was using virtual reality for treating a spider phobic, developing a spider world, and one of my friends in grad school mentioned that he was using hypnosis as his dissertation with Patterson. And I said, how does hypnosis reduce pain? And he goes, well, we don't know how it works, but it may have something to do with distraction. And I said, oh my God, I have an amazing distraction. We should try this with the burn patients, virtual reality. And in fact, what we started out using was Spider World. And the patients said, yeah, my pain was a lot lower, but get that damn thing away from me. You know,
Dr.
this
Hoffman, we have-
wiggly-legged spider.
Dr. Hoffman, we have the video if you want to.
No, that's
no,
okay.
it's okay. All right.
Oh, that video, yeah. I thought you meant Spider World.
All right. Would you
Okay,
like
yeah,
that,
let's
the rest
play
of
that.
Yeah, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
I was on fire. I couldn't see to unbuckle my seatbelt or open the door. I believe my guardian angel just took me out of the truck.
First Lieutenant Samuel Brown. He was so I'll just narrate. So
This is a battle that's going to take years
oh yeah.
to get back to being how it was prior to this.
So while he's getting his wound care, his mind goes off to this virtual snow world with the background music of Paul Simon. So Dave Patterson and I developed Snow World to distract the patients, and we came up with this special helmet. Snow World's the opposite of fire, snowy, cold. It's supposed to cancel out and help distract them from remembering their original injury. So here's the first one was pain-related brain activity without virtual reality. And
What we saw was
big drops.
marked improvement in the range of motion that we were able to achieve, and most importantly, an increased level of comfort.
So just in this, one thing is
I spent some time growing up out in Colorado skiing during the winters and stuff, so, you know, if anything, it, you know, sort of brings back some of those memories.
So some interesting things about Sam Brown, who was very articulate, is a very articulate soldier. He apparently is extremely articulate because he was able to seduce his nurse, and they ended up getting married. So that's
Yeah, it's amazing stuff. So Melissa, so in that case, it's full immersion and it's distraction, right? So you really are, the patient is giving over at least one of their senses completely to the synthetic environment. But Melissa, you've been doing work where it's more mixing reality and it's sort of bringing together some of the more recent AR stuff, right? Where you're bringing, sort of doing overlays on the physical world and in the virtual world. And then could you also talk about how world building more broadly maybe fits into that or doesn't?
Sure. I've been working predominantly in augmented reality for the past few years, and mostly because I'm really interested in us moving our bodies in relationship to technology. Personally, as someone who loves sports and dance and feels like a lot of us have gotten very far away from just being in our physical selves because of our relationship to technology. And we're really interested in whether that can be reversed now that some of these experiences can come off the screen. So I've done that for very high-level technology. I had a piece that I've evolved for the HoloLens that was really about exploring how it changed someone's relationship to story if they were asked to, or provoked to move through it. And recently working on a project with Cliff Bar where we're sort of a mobile-based augmented reality, so very low level in terms of technological delivery, but provoking people to take a hike through Chicago, evoking Zion National Park, and looking at a mashup of wilderness and an urban environment. Really, again, thinking about how we can bring some of these experiences that a lot of us have really gotten away from back into settings where we don't normally encounter them.
Could you talk a little bit about how you came up with the concept of that? Again, it's the process of how do you come up with the idea of overlaying a national monument in downtown Chicago, which is not, to me, an obvious application of AR.
Very adventurous, creative, and collaborative partner in Cliff. I think part of that, actually, that process started with investigating what adventure is, not in I'm a teenage guy on a surfboard, but what is adventure for people who are really taking deep risks, either through sports in the wilderness or in other ways in their lives. And really a design process of having conversations with those people. What were they taking away from those environments that felt like basic to the human condition, stuff we should all learn? And then is there any way to try to bring some of those tidbits of experience back into an urban environment? So, I mean, I think for me today, and hearing all of this, it's always an inspiring event. I feel like what makes this very, very special is most of the people in this room are working on really valid use cases and working against problems that need to be solved. And as someone who spends a lot of time in the pure tech space, I think where it falls down and fails is that we don't need to solve those problems for that group of people most of the time, right? One of the things that we learned from the Cliff work is actually not everyone wants seamless. Seamless maybe is not so good for us. Like, we need some challenge, we need some adventure. And so I think, you know, I appreciate this group for the way that it thinks about those things.
So it looks like we've got a little bit of time before questions. So another lightning round question. So Samit, 30 seconds to describe what your product looks like in 2030.
Wow, in 2030, I think we end up in a situation where doctors, nurses, care providers, and patients are able to get back to the business at hand, which is taking care of each other. Today, Dr. Saxon mentioned earlier, she hates the EMR, the HR. That's because most physicians spend 50% of their time doing data entry. And nurses today spend only 2 to 3 hours in a 12-hour shift actually on direct patient care. So I'm hoping that by applying these technologies to these problems, we have an opportunity to reconnect caregivers to why they got into this business in the first place, and to allow them to go back to kind of the beginning and the art of healing.
So Hunter, same for you. Where would you love to be in 2030 with your setups?
Really distracting virtual worlds.
So are you all guys also looking at other senses, so audio and haptic feedback as well, or is it you focus mostly on visual at this point?
Yeah, you know, we're working with burn patients, and it's very, very limited but I think there is enormous room for improvement, and also moving it out as so many people gain access to VR systems. I think you'll see it being used outside the hospital. It's been centralized, kind of like a CPU, and it's about to become distributed like a PC. And also, as we learn more about virtual reality, I think you'll see it being used for a wide range of different problems. Has a lot of potential. And I think looking at these sensors and having that feedback into what the people see, like brainwave activity affecting what you're seeing in the goggles, and using VR to train people with to interpret the incoming signals from their sensors that you've been describing.
So like a biofeedback setup.
I don't know about biofeedback.
Well, something along those lines.
Yeah.
Or mindfulness, or some combination of those. So Melissa, you've actually imagined a couple of different futures through your world building. Do you have a particular utopian one that you think is actually achievable, using these types of modalities for interaction of, for instance, a virtual physician?
I really look forward to a moment where we have different ways of measuring our wellness. You know, I think a lot of people rely on a scale or a mirror. Those are pretty absurd ways of taking stock of your own state of readiness. And I was thinking a lot about the title of this panel and virtual care assistant. I look forward to a moment where we can collect that data personally and personalize it in the way that's meaningful to us. I don't want a virtual assistant. Maybe I want an avatar, or maybe I want a space that communicates to me, or maybe I just want my lights to turn a different color when I come home. But yeah.
Todd, it's time for questions and answers.
Absolutely.
Questions?
So my one note that I'll say real quick, there's a lot of talk about big data. For me, I prefer to talk about small data because frankly, I don't care about most of the data out there. I only care about the data that's important to me, and that's a tricky calculation.
This question is for the entire panel, but Sumit, you made a comment about the goal is to help people reconnect, whether it's nurses or providers and so forth. And Dr. Saxon made a comment earlier about the EHR and so forth. Most of the technology that gets fed into the system just distracts us more.
Absolutely.
And it's crazy making.
Yeah.
How do you envision that this would sort of seamlessly fit in so that it can take some of the noise out and let us actually reconnect rather than spending all our time trying to deal with the technology aspect of it?
Yeah, I have to credit Gene Roddenberry and all the work from Star Trek. Literally, they did foresee a lot of the future, and I'm sure there's many more ahead of him. But there is that opportunity to stop looking at our devices if we can interact with our senses, with our voice, with our eyes, and with our ears. If we can do those basic things, then that allows us to touch and feel again. So I think that there will be a time where the displays that we all interact with today are there more for what they're traditionally there. They're signposts, they're guides, but we end up interacting more and just use those as informational, and we just speak what we want. We enter orders, we receive data, we pull up data. Well, the EHR has to change. That entire model has to change, and it can't stay the way it is today. And I see a lot of opportunity. That will happen.
This question is also geared to the panel, but there's pros and cons and trade-offs with mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality, and you asked the question of 2030. That means the unborn today will be 13 and they'll live in a world where reality is distorted, very likely. Have you all given thought to the negative impact that has in terms of what is a very different world moving forward?
That question must be for you.
Yeah, so I actually got, how many people in the room have heard of Project Voco by Adobe? Okay, so a couple of you are appropriately horrified. The rest of you, I'm about to horrify you. So let me backtrack a little bit to some of the work that's been done out at ICT when Paul Debevec ran the graphics lab. He pioneered ultra-high resolution facial scanning that was used by Hollywood, so that basically it's a big lighting box, but you would capture all of this, an actor's face and their body, and then when they went to do CGI, they'd pull the right data set for the lighting, and it looks fabulous. So we've been able to scan and then create a synthetic visual representation of an honest-to-God human being that is pretty much imperceptible from physical reality. The long tempo was always the audio, right? That text-to-speech sounds terrible. And Project Voco, Adobe showed it off last October, and basically, they call it Photoshop for voice. It's an algorithm that if you feed it 10 to 20 minutes of recorded audio of someone speaking, and they built this for a reason. They built it for voiceover actors, so that when a voiceover actor would go into the booth, they'd record, they'd go home, and then invariably there would be coughs. They'd have to pick up a few lines, and so it's expensive to bring them back. So they said, wouldn't it be great if we could just go in and then type changes? Well, it turns out they've got an algorithm that'll do that. So you train it on 10 to 20 minutes of audio, and then you can go in and you can type any words that were not spoken by that person, and it is seamless. So now you have seamless visuals that can be completely fabricated and synthesized, and audio. So now we live in a post-evidence society. People talk about fake news. That's not really the half of it. It is as we increasingly engage through screens, through mixed reality, through augmented and virtual reality, this idea of what constitutes evidence is completely vaporized. And so how we're going to navigate that in a thoughtful way and in an ethical manner is something that literally keeps me up at night. And I think this is one of the last bastions of the academy, of what academic institutions should be doing, because the private sector, God love all you guys, but ethics are really not in your development timeline. They're a piece of it, but if it's a choice between getting a product shipped or sort of killing it because it might have a negative, repercussion, it's going to go the way the shareholders want it to go. So it's really not how do we go to the shelter and hide and just say Skynet's active, all is lost, but how do we move forward in a thoughtful way? And part of it is having conferences like this where we can at least start to have the conversation and admit that if technology gives you a good outcome, it can give you a bad outcome. If VR can heal, it's optimized for torture. So how do we lean one direction and try and avoid the other one? And the only way to do that is by having the conversation.
I think there's another thing that I think a lot about in face of your question, and well, two things actually. One is, how do we make sure that this space stays a space for people to create in and not just consume in? And I'm really serious about that. So if it becomes completely owned and dictated by entertainment, games, there's no space for it to be a utility space. It's just going to be another opiate. So that's one thing that I think about a lot. And another thing that I think about a lot is, how do we use it to protect and entice and empower our imaginations instead of getting rid of the idea of the point of having an imagination. So we talked about that with you guys when we were talking about training, with the Army and pilots chair flying, and why is it such a powerful thing to just close your eyes and run the mission in your imagination, and why is that a tool? Well, is that going to be better if you're in full immersion and someone else is running it for you? No, it was that you were driving your way through it. So I think we all just have to ask those questions really carefully.
Other questions? Going once. Oh, there's in the back there, the blue shirt. Thank you for waiting for your microphone.
Sorry to be a downer, but technology really is cool. But it's not the answer. It just poses more questions.
Yeah.
Dr. Hoffman, so you do, your background is in cognitive psychology, and you're trying to affect attention with the VR space that you have. How much then can we start to look at the VR world starting to incorporate attention as an input instead of just as a control mechanism? I know that there's some new technology out allowing for EEG measurements that did not require all the traditional setups, but then there's games starting to be developed off that attention control. And so I'm kind of wondering where you foresee that attention and cognition being part of that input instead of just being part of the outcome.
Do you want to try to answer that one?
Sure. So I think that there's a whole lot of work that's being done on affective computing. So that's a piece of that. So Intel did work early on where they use a webcam and you can judge user sentiment. And now we've done some work collaborative with the main campus where we use these consumer-grade EEGs and we tie them into VR, and we're seeing whether or not we can do stroke rehabilitation. Because it turns out there's a phenomenon with stroke patients, and I'm not an MD, so apologies if I screw this up, but from my understanding of it, is that if you're doing rehab and you're trying to get range of motion, if you think you've had a longer range of motion than you actually have, you actually will get better quicker. So the idea is, if you put a patient into VR and they see we're tracking their hand and their arm, and even though they just move it a little bit, they see them moving their arm, that kind of tricks the brain, and that you can jumpstart this rehabilitation process. So I think when you start to mix that with real world and real time inputs, and my argument about VR is, I usually don't want VR to replicate the real physical world, because that's what the real physical world is about. VR is cool because stupid doesn't hurt. I get to respawn. I don't have to obey the laws of time and physics. And I can be snowbound when I'm sitting in a hospital, right? So to me, VR and that type of distractive immersion is really powerful. And it's a very different experience from the augmented, where you're overlaying things onto a physical reality. So I think what you're talking about, bringing these other sensors in and sort of starting to fuse all of this information, we're getting into this very strange combination of Minority Report and other things. And I think there is a question of, Elon Musk came out and says we have to become cyborgs or risk irrelevance. I reject that totally. I also reject the singularity. I think that humans are not digital, and that they can be used as tools to do amazing things, but I'm not a digit. I'm a continuous thing that was born and lives and dies. And so all of these inputs, if we can apply them in interesting ways to heal people or to educate people or to train them, then that's going to be great. But it really is a bold new world.
These
Yep.
discussions can go on and on and on, but
Yep.
the clock is ticking away. So Todd and Melissa and our other guests, thank you very, very much. Fascinating conversation. Thank you.